This time on The Learning Hack, we're all about behaviour.
Oh, behave.
Behaviour and how to change it. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Hellman.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
Philosophers have only interpreted the world, said Karl Marx. The point is to change it. You can't change the world, as political thinkers of all stripes seem to agree, without changing the way that people behave. Now, your average L&D professional might not want to bring down capitalism, but each and every one of them wants to alter the world around them in some small way. They want individuals in their organisation to perform better. They want them to improve how they function as part of a team. They want to build a learning culture in which everybody can grow and even transform themselves. At its root, learning is about change. But changing human behaviour is hard. That's why we've tracked down one of the world's top learning experts to explain how it works. Kate, what can you tell us about our guest?
Hack facts.
Julie Dirksen is a leading expert in instructional design, e-learning and behaviour change. She's a frequent speaker at industry events and author of one of the best-selling books on instructional design, Design for How People Learn, and an e-learning guildmaster.
Kate, how do you manage to sum up every subject so neatly and yet with such factual accuracy?
Wikipedia.
Right. So Jay, maybe you can sum up what we talked about, Julie and I.
Well, behaviour change, obvs. And it got a bit neuroscience-y at one point. Then there was stuff about feedback, intent, technology. You went big on ethics.
Don't forget the elephants.
Yes, why was there so much about elephants?
Don't think about an elephant.
Now you've said that, I'm thinking about an elephant.
That's how it works. Elephants in the room, eating the elephant. Turns out the elephant is everybody's favourite neurocognitive metaphor.
Is that so?
I had a really interesting discussion with Julie Dirksen. She talked to me from Florida, where she was staying with her family, where it was extremely sunny, with a swimming pool in the background. Meanwhile, I was in Brighton, and the rain was lashing down, and the wind was rattling the windows in their panes. Messed the sound up a bit, sorry about that, but hey-ho. Welcome to The Learning Hack, Julie Dirksen.
Thank you for having me.
Why are there so many elephants in L&D? I mean, this is a rhetorical question, really. I wouldn't expect you to answer that. But Paul Matthews talking about the 5 elephants in the room. Everybody seems to use that thing, don't think of an elephant. Immediately you're thinking of an elephant. But I think the most interesting one for me of those tropes is the elephant rider image you used when I saw you speaking at the e-learning network maybe a year or two back. About behaviour change. For me, that got very simply to the heart of the problem. I think about it a lot, actually. That problem that even when people know what they ought to do, they don't do it, which I know you talk about. So for the listeners, can you explain how that dynamic works in behaviour change and how it should inform learning design?
No, I think that the really interesting behavior change stuff happens when, it's exactly what you just said, when people know what to do, but they still aren't doing it. There's lots of things where we teach people what to do and they'll do it because it's fine. It's, there's no issue there. But then there's also this instance where, people know that they're supposed to wear their safety goggles, or they know that they're supposed to document, everything about a client call, or they know that they're supposed to, eat better and exercise more and all of those kinds of things. And yet, you still find yourself in these situations where it's like you're busy, or it's inconvenient, or you've got other things to think about. We've all got competing priorities right now. So we always have to make a decision about what's the most important thing. Where should I be allocating my attention? And the decision about what's important is at its heart kind of an elephant decision. And so the metaphor comes from a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. And he talks about, if you think about how your brain is structured kind of down by your spinal cord, you have some of the really old functions that are automatic, like breathing and heart rate and reflexes. And then we get things like vision and hearing and gross motor control and fine motor control. So big swaths of your brain are about controlling your body and your senses and what you're perceiving and all of those kinds of things. Then we also have right in the middle of our brains, we have, kind of the seat of a lot of emotional response, your amygdala and your hypothalamus and the limbic system and fight or flight and all of those kinds of things. And then right up in front, right behind your eyes, you get the prefrontal cortex, which is arguably the seat of things like executive control and reasoning and planning for the future and all of this kind of thing. And so, and these are all a little hand wavy because brain geography is way more complicated than that. But the gist of it is that we have a small kind of visceral thinking brain. It's where we kind of have those internal conversations with ourselves. And then we have a big, huge swath of our brain that's controlled by emotions or physicalities or perception and things like that. And the idea is that it's a little rider who's trying to exert control sitting on the back of a big elephant. And when there's a push-pull between those things, when your rider wants one thing and your elephant wants another thing, then, sometimes your rider gets to decide, but a lot of times your elephant is the one who picks, right?
Yeah.
So, the example I always use for this is, when your alarm clock goes off in the morning and it's cold and it's dark and you should get up and you should get up and you really, really know you should get up and you hit the snooze button anyway. That's a case where your rider, who's projecting out into the rest of your morning, it's the part of your brain that understands there's future consequences for actions, is saying, I should get up. But your elephant's like, it's warm and comfortable and delightful here right now, and I think we should stay a little longer.
Yeah.
So, both of these entities play into almost all of our decision making. So how strongly you feel about something or really has a big impact on what you think is important or what you feel like you should allocate your effort to and things like that. And that degree of emotionality is a big part of our decision making. Antonio Damasio is the most interesting researcher in that. He's looked at the neuroscience around whether or not people who have had damage to the emotional areas of their brain and feel very flat affect, they don't get happy, they don't get really sad, whether those people are better or worse decision makers. And the data is unquestionably that they're worse decision makers because we rely on that emotional tug to pull us in one direction or another fundamentally. And so from a learning point of view, this is a problem because we have this tendency to like facts and, sort of unambiguous data and procedures and things like that. But when you take all of the emotion out of it, then it makes it really hard for the elephant to kind of believe that it's important or it's something that we should care about. And that means that if I have 5 things that I need to pick in the same amount of time, I'm going to pick the ones that I feel strongly about. And if you've made this feel emotionless to me, then I don't feel strongly about it. And it's hard for me to decide that it's important.
I think what's interesting to me is the kind of disparity in scale in that metaphor, because, what you described about the mapping of the brain sounds fairly familiar. And in a way, maybe it roughly maps onto the kind of Freudian need, superego, ego that drives sort of thing in a way. But with the rider and elephant metaphor, it's just the pure bulk of the elephant and the tininess of the rider. How difficult, and it's kind of, it's more important, really. The rider is the bigger force, and what you're saying is true that training doesn't take that into account. Isn't it a really big problem for training? Because training is all about a conversation with the rider. And yet what we're actually dealing with in the way that people behave and perform is this whole other thing that's kind of, in a sense, very difficult to control.
Yeah, well, when people are so any decision is often a kind of calculation between effort versus reward or effort versus consequences. So it could be, I expend this effort and I avoid something bad, or I expend this effort and I get something good. But the judgment about how important that consequence or reward is impacted by a lot of variables, not just by how big it is. So if it's the decision to text while driving, right? The possible consequence is you have an accident and you kill yourself and other people. And that's pretty much as bad as we can imagine, right? Like that's sort of the worst thing in our immediate lives in a lot of ways. But we also factor in likelihood, and that's a big one. So is it likely that I will kill somebody if I text while driving? And the answer is it's probably more likely than you think it is. But, if it doesn't feel likely, because you've done it before and you've done it safely, then all of a sudden that factors in. You know, you know, is it going to be immediate? And that one's pretty immediate, but we also have trouble with a lot of behaviors where the feedback is delayed. So, you know, COVID is obviously just sort of a masterclass in delayed feedback and the issues that that causes, because you get infected, but you don't know it right away. So like, you know, the behaviors, and you might not know it, you know, and then you might be infecting other people, but you don't know it right away. And you might, you know, so there's all of these things where if, you know, the minute somebody caught feedback, they know that, or sorry, not caught feedback, the minute they caught COVID, they knew they had it, like we would see very different behaviors happening. But because there's this ambiguity of it, you know, and you're doing something that, you know, the guidelines say is risky, but yet you've done it several times now and you've gotten away with it every single time, you know, means that you're like, okay, now it doesn't feel as likely. So going to the store is a risky behavior, except, you know, I've gone to the store many times, you know, since this all started. And so now it feels less risky, even though, you know, with the information about new variant strains and things like that, it's probably getting more risky than it was 4 or 5 months ago. But these are just all really hard things. I mean, even hand washing is one of my favorite examples, in that intellectually, I know that my hands aren't that clean right now. Like if I was going to perform a medical procedure, they wouldn't be clean enough. But it's entirely the writer that knows things like germ theory and so forth. Because if I wash my hands right now, they look pretty clean. They're going to look exactly the same after I wash them. They might be a little drier, but that's, you know, that's about it. And so it's the writer that has to remind the elephant that hand washing matters every single time.
But
the elephant's
would just
like,
say, they look clean enough, I'll accept an apple or a bun from you.
Right, exactly. And the elephant, you know, like I don't think we have a hand washing problem where people who have visible soil on their hands, you know, whether it's blood from a medical procedure or, you know, dirt from anything, like those people I think are mostly washing their hands. It's the people whose hands look fine that have to kind of keep reminding themselves that even though they look fine, even though their visual feedback says your hand is okay, it's not really. You know, because but germs are invisible. And so it's an intellectual process.
Another thing that's very central to what you talk about is feedback, making it visceral, specific, immediate. Could you talk a bit about that in terms of where a lot of current learning design goes wrong and how it could work better?
Yeah, you know, one of the big issues is how much. So sometimes I talk about the difference between knowledge and belief. So I know that this is the right answer, but I believe something a little bit different, right? And belief is this emotional, visceral process and things like that. And so something about experiencing consequences makes a really big difference. So going back to the texting while driving example, intellectually, I know it's bad, but my actual feedback on it the few times that I've done it is it was okay. Nothing bad happened, right? So now I'm fighting with my intellectual knowledge against my personal experience of things. And now you've got these two factors wrestling in. And so one of the things that we want to look at is, can I give you more personal experience so that it's not, these two aren't fighting with each other, then they agree essentially. So with texting while driving, there's been a lot of work done around like virtual reality simulations so that you can experience the consequences of it and things like that. And the results on that have been mixed. I don't think the study outcomes, I think they have a trouble getting real data on whether those are working or not. So I don't want to overdo it. But one of my favorite studies in the last probably 10 years or something was one that was done in the Stanford Virtual Reality Lab. And they wanted to look at people's behavior around using disposable paper. And so they were talking to them about the consequences of, if you use this much, paper towels, if you use this many paper towels, here's how many trees need to be cut down to support that habit. And so half of the people went and read about trees being cut down, so very cognitive condition. And the other half went into a virtual reality environment where they were cutting down virtual trees with a virtual chainsaw. And the chainsaw would fall over and the floor would shake and there was noise and, there was a physicality to it and all this kind of stuff. And they asked both groups when they came out, will you use less paper? And both groups said, yes, because, that was a cognitive question, right? Because it's this projecting out into the future. So it's very much a rider question. But they also would do a thing where they would take a glass of water and they would accidentally spill it while people were leaving the room, and then count how many paper towels people used to mop up the spill. And the people who had been in the more visceral condition, where they were having the actual experience of trees being cut down, used almost 20% less paper than the people who had just been in the cognitive condition.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting thing to me, because a lot of times feedback and learning takes the form of, no, that's not the right answer, and here's why, which is essentially a cognitive activity, as opposed to, let me show you the consequence of that, making that choice. So it could be a sales scenario where you're picking a cell phone to sell to a particular customer, and the cognitive feedback would say, that's not the right phone, here's why, versus the customer walking away and buying a phone from your competitor across the way. And there seems to be, and I don't want to overstate from a single study and things like that, but there seems to be some data that says you can produce intention with cognitive stuff, but if you actually want to produce the behavior, there's some better benefit to having some kind of visceral experience of the consequences, as opposed to just being told it was a bad idea.
Are there ways of doing a similar sort of thing in a 2D environment with a less immersive technology?
I don't think it has to be VR. I don't think it has to be that physical thing. I think you can just literally, write your feedback differently in like a e-learning program or something, where instead of being told by a disembodied, the disembodied voice of authority that this is a bad choice, instead you just see what happens and you draw your own conclusions from it, which is a more active learning process anyway.
It's a big argument in favour of using analytics and kind of looking at what people actually do in the workplace in terms of transfer of learning, because what people say they know is different to what people actually do, and it's only the terrible sneakiness of experimental psychology, that kind of with the hand washing, and the tissues, the use of tissues to mop up paper, is exactly the sneaky sort of thing they do that actually reveals behaviour is different.
Well, we just have a disconnect, and it happens a lot in research because measuring actual behaviors can be hard. It's a tricky thing, right? So we have an unfortunate tendency for a lot of the research to measure intent, either knowledge or intent, and not behavior. And we know that intent is not the same thing. It's there's the knowing doing gap and all of that kind of thing. Like, intent is often a necessary part of it. People have to intend to often do the behavior in order for it to happen, but it does not in and of itself mean that they will do the behavior.
But how does tech change the dynamics in behaviour? A lot of what we've been talking about is kind of interpersonal interactions. But now in our daily lives, we're all gradually becoming more and more used to interacting with technology in a very personal, intimate, even biological sort of way. So we have these smartphones that we're glued to. We have fitness trackers that track our heart rates. We have recommendation engines, social media. Whatever you pay attention to is kind of noticed. You're heard by technology in a way that you're not necessarily heard by your employer. That relationship just seems to wind tighter and tighter as the tech gets more sophisticated. So I'm wondering what opportunities on the plus side of this. We'll have time to look at the negative side perhaps later. But on the plus side, what opportunities does this provide in the context of workplace learning to achieve things that are difficult in human context?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one in relationship to behavior change, and absolutely, there's a lot of kind of sort of scary stuff that's possible with this. And so if we kind of put a pin in that whole conversation, the biggest, I think, potential benefit to all of this stuff really is taking behaviors that are somewhat invisible and making where the feedback's somewhat invisible and making it visible to people. So, I think I have yet to find a behavior change problem where delayed or absent feedback wasn't inherently part of the issue, right? So that's like I said, the COVID example or the hand washing example or any of these kinds of things. If you don't wash your hands as a healthcare professional, you may never find out that you not washing your hands on that day caused an infection to happen in the ward, or that, people got sick, or that people died. If you didn't do a very good job of mask wearing, you're probably never going to know what the consequences of that are directly. I mean, obviously if you infect your family, then that's a different thing, because you actually do get that feedback, but it's delayed, right? You engage in a behavior and then you don't find out for days or weeks that it's a behavior with a problem. And so if you think about something like exercise, one of the questions you always want to ask about a behavior is, when do the benefits of doing this positive behavior become visible? And so if you're exercising, you're expending a lot of effort. So the cost is all now. And if you like exercise, great. Then it's got an immediate positive for you. But if you don't particularly like exercise and you're making yourself do it, it's maybe, depending on the intensity of the exercise you're doing, you might not notice like actual benefits for like 4 or 6 weeks. That's a really long time for somebody, for our elephants to hang in with a behavior without seeing any positive benefit of it. But if you've got, a fitness tracker and you find that rewarding for you, then you get feedback today that you did 2,000 more steps than you did yesterday, and you get a some nifty badge or something that tells you you did great. Or if we tie it into something that's social, you get the satisfaction of, I did more than the other people that I'm competing with. So that's a positive. And so that takes something that used to be 4 to 6 weeks away, and like moves it a much closer. Now it's not as compelling perhaps as, some kind of physical benefit that you actually feel. But it's, it's a lot closer. And so there's, we were talking about the ELN thing, I know I talked about the hyperbolic discounting. So a reward is worth the most if I get it immediately. And as soon as I start to push that reward into the future, you start to discount the value of the reward, and it kind of falls off in a hyperbolic curve. And so if you talk about consequences, you could do it with consequences too. So if I smoke a cigarette today, there's a 20% chance that I might die of lung cancer in 20 years. Well, that's a really long time away. So if I smoked a cigarette today and there was a 20% chance that I was going to die of lung cancer tomorrow, that would have a much bigger impact on smoking behaviors than 20 years away, right? Because for a lot of reasons, right? There's a bunch of reasons why that kind of comes into play. But if we can move the point of consequence or reward closer to the point of the behavior, then it feels more important, again, to the elephant, even though it's exactly the same consequence or reward, but depending on when it happens, that makes a big, big difference in how strongly people feel it.
You are data.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
Every pulse of your heart, every step you take, the place you travel to, the thing that gets your attention, it all leaves a trace in data. And the world reconfigures itself around you, moment to moment, based on that data.
You are data. You are data.
Data has learned a lot about you over the years. Isn't it time you learned more about data?
You are data. You are data. You are data. You are data.
Data is a hot topic in learning right now, perhaps the hottest. But when you look at what's happened historically with learning analytics, it's hard to deny that it's been a little bit stuck. Stuck in the first 2 levels of Kirkpatrick. Stuck in what David Wilson and Charles Jennings have called the conspiracy of convenience. Stuck in a lack of capability, money, and time to evaluate. So how can we get ourselves out of this endless Mobius loop of wanting to do it all, but ending up not actually doing very much? I've talked to a lot of experts and practitioners, and the result is a whole series of guides and resources that Learning Pool will be releasing to help you map your way out of that loop. Download the first of these now. The Data and Learning White Paper.
You are data. You are data. You are data.
Is there a point though where this becomes slightly coercive?
Yeah. No, I think anything where we're operating at sort of the level of anybody's kind of emotional or unconscious, we have an extra level of responsibility to ensure that there's, kind of ethical use of it. And, there's a variety of different ways. There's some different conversations about the ethics of different behavior change efforts. And some of it comes down to disclosure. Does the person know that this is what's happening? Are you sort of, explaining, is this something that the person themselves wants to do? Or are you trying to persuade them something that they wouldn't ordinarily want to do? So I want to exercise more. You're going to use certain methods that are more, more elephant type motives, methods to help me exercise more. But if I've expressed this intention and I've kind of signed on for this. So at Google, if you've ever been in a Google office, one of the great things about going there is the food's really good, but they've done a lot of like tweaking of the food environment. So the little micro kitchens where they have snacks, they like put the sugary beverages down at the bottom of the cooler behind a frosted pane, and they put the water right up at eye level. And the way that the cafeterias are organized is you get like salads and stuff up front, and then you get the less good for you things after you've maybe already filled your plate with healthier options. And there's a number of different things, but everybody there knows it. Like they all know that this is what's happening, and they can all explain it to you and tell you about it and things like that. So, is it a little bit manipulative? Maybe. Is it something that people can be on board with? In the book Nudge, which is Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, they just talked about this quite a bit, about the ethics of nudge and this sort of, I think they referred to it as kind of a libertarian paternalism or something like that. I could be getting that term wrong, but basically the idea of like not taking any choices away from people, but just in terms of how you architect the way the choices are available, so people can still do anything that they want. They still have a set of choices, but making it so that those choices are friendlier from an elephant point of view, I guess.
Yeah, this is a problem, I suppose, for Ellen. Just today I was listening to a podcast about marketing and how that relates to learning, how you can use marketing insights. And as a marketing person myself, I always felt it's very, very different. L&D people have a very different kind of setup. Marketers, you're all with the elephant. Let's crank up the elephant stuff and smoke more fags, eat more sweets. Whereas on the training side, it's presumed to be a certain kind of ethical thing comes in, that you're not really allowed to use sort of game logic too much, because you can get people addicted to training, and then they don't want to go back to work and stuff like that.
I'm not super worried about people getting addicted to training, because I don't think any of the training people are good enough at the game logic and things like that to make that happen. But if we were good at it, then there would be a bigger issue. No,
I think isn't that a bit kind of what's the word, self-effacing, a bit British actually. But I think training people have a harder thing to do, because it's always harder to persuade people to do the right thing and the considered thing than it is to get them to be all for the elephant, like the marketing people. So I think training people beat themselves up too much.
Yeah, well, I had somebody ask me at a workshop once, how could we use some of these behavior change techniques to get people to work more than 40 hours a week? And I'm like, I don't know if I want to answer that question. And it's like there's and in fact I think I did dodge it, but I mean, like, I don't know. I don't know that I think that that's what you should be trying to do, just from a kind of an ethical point of view. But then also, like, I don't know that having people work way more than, I don't believe that. I also don't believe that that's really a productive, choice for anybody, the organization or anything like that. And there was quite a lot of stuff around, say, Uber drivers and the manipulation of certain things on the app to encourage certain behaviors and things like that. And they were getting kind of scrutinized a little bit more closely about it. And we're dealing with this, across all of the technologies in terms of ethical issues. I read a piece, and I wish I could credit it, but I can't remember who wrote it, but it was talking about how chemists had to sort of come to an ethical reckoning around the invention of things like dynamite. And obviously physicists had to come to a bit of an ethical reckoning around things like nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And now we're kind of bumping into this with tech, where we've just been building all the cool toys and things. And, we're seeing obviously in the broader society that some of this stuff that was not intended to be problematic is very problematic, and that we
Yeah, and
need
as
to kind of have some
Susanna
conversations about it.
Zhuzhov, I think, can I pronounce her name probably, says quite rightly, in a way, lawmakers have been asleep at the switch on this. It's kind of crept in and nobody really noticed this happening, and now we're all kind of,
Yeah, and we're playing catch up, and in a way that's, technology is going to evolve faster than legislation. Like, that's just a given. And so how do we create protections that are meaningful? Because we get, you know, in the US for accessibility guidelines, we have the 508 guidelines, which is part of, you know, like, how do you make accessible websites and things like that. And they've been updated, and they're not as bad now, but for years they contained all sorts of weird technical details about, like, server-side image maps and things like that, that were just irrelevant because the technology had moved on from most of that stuff. And so the idea that we were legislating exactly what technology should be used for something was ridiculous, because there's no way that this law can keep up with, or these guidelines or regulations or whatever they were, could keep up with the technology. But you need to figure out how to frame the intent of it in such a way that it's maintained no matter what happens on the tech side.
Yeah, in a way, it seems logical that those type of ethical concerns should come to lodge in kind of learning HR part of the organisation, because in a way, you know, where else they're going to sit. I'd like to talk now about maybe a more kind of specific problem of L&D. I've been saying that I don't think L&D people should beat themselves up quite as much as they do about certain things. But in this regard, there is a nasty little problem around feedback in L&D that you mentioned in the interview with Guy Wallace, the 3 questions interview. That it's because of the lack of feedback, the lack of, you know, analysing, evaluating, learning, and so on, that we all know about. It condemns the profession to always be focusing on more for less, doing stuff faster and cheaper, cost saving, efficiencies, and so on, because it doesn't have much to put on the plus side of the balance sheet because of the lack of evaluation, yada yada. Something that comes up a lot in relation to why L&D doesn't evaluate is the conspiracy of convenience, a tacit agreement not to upset the apple cart by evaluating, which probably plays a part here. But that feels to me like a behaviour change problem.
I think it absolutely is. And I do think I need to probably, so I have this framework that comes out of University College London, Susan Mickey and the Center for Behavior Change there, called the COMBI analysis. And it's a framework for analyzing behaviors. And I do need to do a full COMBI at some point around the evaluation problem in learning and development. Yeah, you know, I think we have this big picture thing of like, oh, bad stuff happens if we don't train people. So we have that level of, you know, like that level of evaluation. There's sort of, but it's viewed in many organizations as a necessary evil and not an area of investment. So if you spend money buying new equipment, that's an investment that's supposed to pay off, and you have a way of amortizing that. And, you know, there's an accounting procedure behind it and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But if you put more money into training, that typically is not viewed as an investment, that's viewed as a cost. And, you know, most organizations have a push to minimize costs. And so they're trying to do the same thing, but, you know, that they've been doing, but do it cheaper, faster and cheaper, essentially, which has turned into this problem in L&D because we have a difficult time demonstrating our value. And it's a hard problem, right? You know, if I do a communication skills training, it may have real value, but boy, that's going to be hard to measure in an organization in terms of actual behaviors and things like that. And, you know, we've had this thing around Kirkpatrick's levels, right? Which are great, but what happens is people do the easier parts, which tend to be levels 1 and 2. You know, level 1 is the easiest one. I just put a survey in front of you at the end of the class. Level 2 is a little harder, but still I can do multiple choice tests, whatever. I have mechanisms in place for that. Level 3, which is the behavior happening, is much harder to measure because you know, it's expensive, it's complicated. You know, a lot of times people in L&D don't have the kind of pull within an organization to get that kind of measurement in place. So Kathy Moore, who talks about a lot about scenario-based design, always has a thing about whenever she's talking to somebody about a problem, she always asks the question of what thing that you are already measuring will change if this training is successful. And if they can't answer that question, she'll really push pretty hard on it, because she's like, you're measuring some things. You must be tracking something. Is it sales? Is it the rate of accidents? Is it, infection rates in healthcare? Like what's already being measured that should be impacted if we do this training? Because, and I think that's a very realistic view of hers, because it's really difficult for us from an L&D point of view to get them to measure something they're not already measuring. We've tried, it's hard. I'm also a big fan of looking smaller scale. We tend to think that the only way that we can measure is to go whole audience, right? And that's not necessarily the case, right? I can do user testing with half a dozen people and get good feedback on, some digital solution that I'm building, and then bring that back in. And that's not the whole audience. It's not proof, but it's still a feedback loop that I wouldn't have if I wasn't doing that. We can do cohort analysis. We can follow a small group through a training process and count the behaviors of 20 people as opposed to counting the behaviors of 2,000 people. And, that's a much cheaper enterprise, but it's still going to give us data. Now, none of this is perfect, but honestly, any data at this point, I think, is better than the answer that we usually have, which is almost no data back about actual performance coming into things. And the issue with that is when we don't have any kind of proof, even if it's anecdotal proof, because I did interviews with my target audience, something that I can tell a story about when I'm presenting it back to leadership. If we, in the absence of having more of a complete data set around behavior change, when I'm trying to establish my value, if I can't bring those things to the table in any form, then I'm just sort of asserting that it's the right thing to do. And I feel like we as an industry spend a little bit too much time with the asserting that it's the right thing to do, or we show improvement in the areas where we do have some control. So I can't control what happens with all these people when they go back out to the workplace, but I can control counting how many people took the course, or I can control the quiz score that they got at the end of it. There's a great Gloria Gary quote about how why don't we just weigh them, number of pounds, number of tons of users trained, like these are the vanity metrics idea, and the fact that we're counting a bunch of things that ultimately, don't really point to any kind of behavior change. So I would argue that even if you're only doing small scale stuff, anything that provides a feedback loop back in. And what happens with this, it's particularly, when I talk about user testing, when I present on that, I'll often ask people if they've taught live classroom. So this might be a group of people that's moving over to e-learning and they were teaching live classroom. And I'm like, have you ever not changed anything about the way that you taught a class between the first time you taught it and the second time you taught it? And the answer is no, of course not. Everybody's always at least tweaked some little detail. But an e-learning program gets thrown out there into the world, and it's, it's that first version, and it just stays that way forever. And we get very little data back about how our users are behaving in an LMS or in an e-learning program. We get scores, we get time, time in course, we get completion status, and that's about it, which is another whole rant that I could go on, is how poorly we have done being able to create any kind of interactive element for learners inside digital tools, and understanding, are they looking at stuff, are they clicking on things, what are they doing, what seems to be useful for them, any of that kind of information could feed back into my own feedback as a learning designer, and I usually don't get that. I don't usually know. I can design all sorts of great stuff, but I often I'm in a position where we don't really know what worked and what didn't work from the things that we designed. And I think that puts us in a very defensive position as an industry. And that's unfortunate, because if we could have some data, we would just get better at stuff, and we wouldn't have to feel like we're constantly having to defend our value to the organization, because we can't point to things that establish our value.
As an elder learner, something I've been very focused on myself is how hard it is to put yourself in the position of being a novice again once you've reached a degree of competence in your professional practice. And, marketing people occasionally have to do this again and again because the pace of digital learning is so fast. Digital marketing has been so fast. And you've spoken about the really difficult cognitive load that doing something new imposes. Like we go to, I think your example was you go to a foreign country and you have to drive on the other side of the road. And in the same way, people are avoidant of training because you're placing them in that position. Do you have tips on how to overcome that resistance to being trained?
Yeah, well, so the big issue there, right, is that as we do things, we develop automaticity, and it actually gets stored in a different area of your brain once you've turned it into sort of an automatic thing. And a huge number of the things we do throughout the day, we do without having to think about them very much. And that is an enormous benefit to us humans because it creates tremendous efficiency. So on the driving example, if you think about automaticity, if you've ever had the thing where you drive home from work and you realize as you're pulling into the driveway at home that you totally don't remember the drive home at all. Like it's just, you were thinking about other things, it was just gone. And that's an example of automaticity. So the act of driving is very automatic and that particular route is very automatic. But when we want to interrupt an automatic behavior, that sometimes causes all sorts of problems. So if you were supposed to stop at the grocer's and pick up dinner on the way home, you still do the thing where you find yourself pulling into the driveway and realize you completely forgot about the fact that you were supposed to turn left, a mile and a half back and go to the store and pick some things up. And now you're home because you were operating on that autopilot. And the autopilot is great. It is a wonderful benefit, but it does create this thing where interrupting the autopilot is really hard sometimes. And if you take somebody who has a lot of their workflow in that automated so that they can operate at a very high level because they don't have to think about 80 to 90% of what they're doing, and then they can use most of their cognitive energy to focus on that 10% of like hard problems and things like that. That's somebody who, part of the reason that it's often difficult is that somebody who feels a very strong sense of competence and that their expertise allows them to do this. And then you take them and you break several things about what they're supposed to do by changing the process or changing the computer system or changing the environment or whatever you're changing. And then all of a sudden everything feels, they have to constantly stop and go, oh no, I'm supposed to go pick up dinner, constantly interrupt all those automatic gestures and do the new thing. And so that creates a bunch of issues. One is, it all feels stupid and clunky and awkward to them. So you're going to have a certain amount of resistance because they're like, the old way was working great for me. And now you want me to do this. And this feels bad. I don't like it. But you're also interfering with their sense of their own mastery, their sense of competence, which is a pretty big, deep motivator, right? As a sense of mastery and competence and things like that. And so when you interfere with that, you have to do that really carefully because you're gonna create a lot of resistance from just the fact that like people don't like feeling good at something and then being made to feel bad at something. An example I always use as a friend of mine was a traditional publishing editor for many years. And then she went and worked for a digital content strategy firm. And the first month that she was there, she's like, I felt like I should wear a sign around my neck that said, no, I'm smart, really. Because she just felt so out of place. And they had hired her for all of these wonderful editorial skills that they had. And they were totally happy with her. They thought she was doing great, but just the awkwardness of translating this into a really different digital function was really, really hard for the first few months that she was there. And then it worked its way out and she was fine and things like that. But what we tend to do in training is somebody's used to operating at this high level, and then you bring them back down here to sort of more of a beginner level, and you let them practice the thing once, and then you send them out into the world. And they're kind of going, this is a terrible idea and I hate everything about this. But what you could do is you could bring them in, bring them down here, but let them practice enough that it starts to get a little bit easier, which is not once, it's 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 times or whatever it is. But then, you're not going to get them all the way back up to the level that they're at, but you're at least going to leave them on an upward trajectory so that they're at least going, okay, if I keep doing this, it will get back. I have some confidence it'll get back, as opposed to leaving them at the bottom of at the bottom where they're like, this is a terrible, terrible idea. And so that's one of the biggest issues that I see with that is when we break those automatic behaviors and are trying to instill new ones, almost always the learning and development efforts don't include enough practice to start to you know,
Yeah.
like I said, you're not going to get them all the way back up there. That's fine. But if you can at least leave them with a feeling of like, oh, okay, the first time I did this seemed horrible, but now that I'm on the third time, okay, it's starting to make sense. It's starting to be a little bit easier. And I think if people leave the classroom at that point, you're getting a very different, you know, a very different world than, you know, and a very different set of attitudes than if you leave them at the after just the first time when they go, this is horrible.
So spaced practice, I suppose, is the it's like cliche term to bring into that. It seems to me it's going to become, well, it feels to me like it will become really important, this, because there's this constant talk we get about people having to retrain constantly throughout their careers now with the fourth industrial revolution and everything. So it's something that it's worth L&D people listening to you so they can nail it.
Yeah, well, and the other
one of the many reasons.
Yeah, the other big piece of it is that I don't think we're doing a good enough job of enlisting our most expert performers in these conversations. So if you've got somebody who has a high degree of confidence about how they're supposed to do things and you involve them in the conversation of how to change it, then they've vested in that conversation and they will model that behavior for some of the less expert performers. But if you treat them like they're stupid and kind of disregard all of the knowledge about whatever task it is that they've built up over many years, they're going to resist you pretty hard at that point. And so, you know, there's a big, you know, in other areas of design, there's a big kind of question about things like co-design. And I really think if people just feel like you're treating them and their knowledge respectfully and including them in the conversation to a certain extent, I think that can make a big difference as well.
Finally, if people want to follow your thought, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, I have a few places. My website is usablelearning.com. Although I'm not blogging very much there, I do also have Usable Learning as my Twitter account. But the place where I'm probably a little bit more active too is I have a Facebook group called Design for How People Learn, which is also the title of the book. And so that's a really great place to engage because there's a whole bunch of smart instructional design folks in that group. And so that's usually where I'll put out kind of new thoughts that I'm thinking about or, you know, interesting things that I bump into and so forth. So, and also always happy to answer questions there if there's anything that people want to know a little bit more about.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Julie. You brought not only food for thought, but also a little bit of Florida sunshine into the rainy south of Britain. Thanks a lot.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Julie and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
And don't forget to leave a glowing review and a 5-star rating to help other people find us. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com.
Next time on the Learning Hack.
With a Master's in Adult Education and a PhD in Instructional Design, Paige Chen, a remote learner, certainly has her theory chops. But we'll be discussing how the learning systems of today really match up with what theory tells us about how people learn.
Stay classy, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
I am. I'm actually, I usually am in Minneapolis, which is very cold and snowy this time of year, but I did the most COVID avoidant road trip I could possibly manage and came to visit my folks for the holidays. So this is my view right now.
Wow.
That's the office. So I was like, you know what? This is a really good year not to spend the whole winter in Minneapolis. I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, behave.